Welcome back to On Assignment. President Trump is used to being a divisive figure. He's even used to low approval numbers. But here in South Korea, his numbers are especially harsh. Only 17% of those asked in a recent poll said they had confidence in him. That's a 71-point drop from Obama standing here. Of course, South Koreans don't get a vote on who becomes the president of the United States, but they do have strong opinions on that. Opinions they aired the day President Trump landed here. When President Trump rolled into Seoul, crowds lined the streets. Many were here to welcome the president with open arms, American flags, and a rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn early night?
Traditionally, South Koreans have welcomed Americans, servicemen and presidents alike, warmly.
We believe United States, and we love United States.
But things are changing here. Just across the street, we found another, equally passionate crowd. They were here to tell the American president to go home. Police officers cordoned off the protesters who tried to surge forward. President Trump is expected to pass by here any minute. The police have just started to push in, trying to keep the protesters back. They don't want them to block the president's path. But things soon calmed down again. This was not a violent crowd. You're holding a sign? What does it say?
It says, peace, not war.
Peace, not war.
Yeah.
Soo-yeon Jung is 29 years old. She's one of the leaders of the protest.
In here, there are lots of students, university students, who doesn't want Donald Trump visiting Korea.
The divide is striking. Those waving the American flags are generally older. Those holding up the "No Trump, no war" signs tend to be much younger.
The younger generation here, they're not so interested in North Korea because they haven't grown up with it in their lives. Older generation, they remember when it was just Korea, or the Japanese colonial era, for example. So they have more of a direct sense of, there was one country and now we're divided.
Daniel Tudor came here as a teacher, but fell in love with South Korea. He now runs a chain of bars that serve craft beer. He says for the older generation, there is a sense of unfinished business with North Korea.
I think probably for that generation, if you're of that age, you might think, well, why don't we just get this done? In my lifetime, I want to see this over, regardless of what happens.
The memory of the bitter war between North and South defines the Korean peninsula in a profound way. No one here disputes the fact that it was a massive influx of U.S. troops that saved South Korea from falling into communist hands. For generations, gratitude for that and for the protection that U.S. troops still stationed here 64 years after the end of the fighting defined this country. Not anymore. By nightfall, the number of anti-Trump protesters swelled. Soo-yeon and her fellow protesters had watched the president's speech on their phones. This is, after all, South Korea. Everything here is streamed live.
USA!
On the pro-American side of the street,
Mr. Trump!
the feeling was that, if anything, the president should have gone further.
We strongly demand, request, Mr. Donald Trump, please strike North Korea right now. He is thinking about our casualty, but I want to say to him, don't worry, please don't worry, Koreans. We are ready to sacrifice our lives.
Chae Tae-sun was a lieutenant colonel in the South Korean army. His stance is stoic and simple. Better dead than red. So you're willing to accept the huge costs that a war would
And
cause?
sacrifice, I may die, which will be fine. Just kill the North Korean Kim Jong-un.
The feeling across the other side of the street was entirely different. Why is he allowed to speak at our parliament? Shouted Soo-yeon. No Trump, no war. By day, Soo-yeon works as a pharmacist. In Korea, it takes 4 years of medical school on top of a good college education to qualify for the job. She's worked hard to get here, but when we sat down to talk, She sounded downbeat about her future.
We can think about our future. Hey, think about it. If we keep our money or we keep our job, we do lots of things for our future, we study hard. But eventually, if there's a war happen, it's nothing.
It all goes away.
We can't imagine our future.
It's a historical irony that the younger generations here who grew up in modern Seoul, one of the richest cities in Asia, are bitter about their future.
I think we lost our own independent power at the global table.
How does that feel?
If Kim Jong-un or Trump decided to make war in Korean Peninsula, there's nothing we can do. It's a crazy thing.
It's not something that you think about, day to day. But yeah, it's always there.
Do they feel like the shadow of death is hanging over them?
If it really happens, I'll be dead in 5 minutes. So it's better to not think about it.
Okay?
When Soo-young and her friends go out, they don't talk about politics or war. They talk about friends and plans and work.
Do you prepare for potential conflict?
Actually, I don't, because if there's a war, it's gonna be a minute or 2 minutes that I have to. There's no option to be alive. It's like we just live only today.
Live in the moment.
No tomorrow for us. We only have this moment.
So when I go out in the street and I see the places happy and buzzing.
Yeah, that's why. We always having concert and go to movies or love each other, but we only concerned about today. That's why, because we're not sure about tomorrow.
One thing everyone we talked to agreed on is that there may be two Koreas, but one people. They long for the day when they can be reunited with their neighbors and relatives on the other side of the border. But the people of North Korea don't get a vote. Only their leader does, Kim Jong-un. So next, we try to figure out what he is all about and why his regime's pursuit of nuclear power may not be as foolish as it sounds. It's easy to dismiss the regime as a caricature. The bad guys in the Team America movie.
I don't have any weapons of mass destruction, okay, Hans?
But it's worth looking past the bizarre cult of personality and the goose-stepping troops and trying to actually understand what the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, might be thinking. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
Day 295 of the Trump administration, and tonight it is now clear that the attention of Robert Mueller is, for the time being at least, bearing down on Mike Flynn, the retired U.S. Army general who was one of the stalwarts of the Trump campaign effort and who served as national security advisor for 24 days in the West Wing. NBC News reports today Mueller is investigating a possible deal between senior Turkish officials and Flynn during the presidential transition. This report says in part, quote, 4 people familiar with the investigation say Mueller is looking into whether Flynn discussed orchestrating the return to Turkey of a chief rival of Turkish President Erdogan, who lives in the U.S. Flynn was offered upwards of $15 million to be paid directly or indirectly if he could complete the deal, according to 2 sources familiar with the meeting. Flynn's lawyers released a statement about the story saying, quote, "We have intentionally avoided responding to every rumor or allegation raised in the media, but today's news cycle has brought allegations about General Flynn ranging from kidnapping to bribery that are so outrageous and prejudicial that we are making an exception to our usual rule. They are false." Flynn, you'll recall, among Trump's earliest campaign supporters. He served on the transition team before following the new president to the White House. Former acting Attorney General Sally Yates over at Justice had testified that 6 days after Trump took the oath of office, she warned the White House Flynn was compromised with the Russians. She also testified that Vice President Mike Pence had unknowingly made false statements about Flynn's conversations with the Russians. An administration official has said Pence was relaying what Flynn told him. 18 days after Yates' warning, Trump fired Flynn. Here's how he explained why he did it.
Mike Flynn is a fine person, and I asked for his resignation. He respectfully gave it. He is a man who there was a certain amount of information given to Vice President Pence, who's with us today, and I was not happy with the way that information was given.
Did you direct Mike Flynn to discuss sanctions with the Russian ambassador
No, I didn't.
prior to your
No, I didn't.
inauguration?
No, I didn't.
And would
Mike,
you have fired him if the information hadn't leaked out?
No, I fired him because of what he said to Mike Pence. Very simple. Mike was doing his job. He was calling countries and his counterparts. We ultimately fired, but we fired for a different reason.
You're talking about General Flynn?
General Flynn, yes.
Because of lying to the vice president?
Yeah, but everything plays in. Everything plays into it. But we fired him because he said something to the vice president that was not so.
Let's bring in our starting panel on a Friday night, shall we? NBC News national political reporter Julia Ainsley, who is one of the authors of that Flynn report we quoted. More on that in just a moment. Political White House reporter Matthew Nussbaum is back with us. And here with us in New York, Jennifer Rogers, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Good evening and welcome to you all. Julia, you get to go first because of the panelists you made the news today. Tell us this story as best you can for a lay audience, including how in the name of God it also includes the Poconos in Pennsylvania?
That is a good question, and I will break that down for you as simply as I can. Basically, we know that Robert Mueller is looking into whether or not Michael Flynn and his associates met in a December 2016 meeting at the 21 Club in New York. That is an upscale restaurant just blocks away from the Trump Tower, where Flynn was serving on the presidential transition team. We understand from sources who are familiar with this meeting that they allegedly talked about a $15 million bribe that they would try to give Flynn once he was national security advisor if he could see that Fethullah Gulen was removed from the United States. Gulen, of course, is a political opponent of Turkish President Erdogan. He's an elderly cleric living in the Poconos. In order to remove him, that could have been through a kidnapping operation or through extradition. We also know that the FBI had re-upped their investigation. They were asked to re-up their investigation into Gulen at the beginning of the Trump administration when Flynn served as national security advisor. This was after they had already dismissed this investigation under Obama. So we're looking at a number of pieces, but what Mueller is really trying to drill down on here is whether or not Michael Flynn, Trump's first national security advisor, was exploited to use his position in the U.S. government in order to serve the interests of another country, that country being Turkey.
And Julia, isn't it true that we also know about this meeting and the Turkish angle because a certain former CIA director came in and thought it didn't look or sound right to him, and he has since told that story?
So, Brian, that's actually two separate stories. The former CIA director, Woolsey, is referring to a September meeting. That was before the election when these Turkish officials talked to Michael Flynn about using his position just within his own lobbying firm, the Flynn Intel Group, and trying to orchestrate a forcible removal, possibly a kidnapping of Gulen. This meeting that we know about now actually happened during the transition when Flynn knew he would be becoming national security advisor later, and it may have involved a more legal route, such as an extradition. Of course, it is not normal, not appropriate routes for an extradition request to come from the White House. It's supposed to come through diplomatic channels in the Justice Department.
So, Counselor, this comes down to you. Someone said on social media today that if there could be anything funny taken out of this, this could be the plot from a Coen Brothers movie with General Flynn driving around the Poconos looking for this old guy to send out of the country. As a former prosecutor, what alarm bells go off in your head?
Well, it's not good for Flynn no matter how you slice it. If he's talking about taking money to try to orchestrate a return of Gulen to Turkey through official channels, then you're talking about serious bribery offenses. You're not allowed to take money to do things for your government job, right, except your salary. If you're talking about him trying to orchestrate some illegal operation, it's obviously a federal crime to orchestrate a kidnapping that crosses international lines. So either way you look at it, he's talking about committing a very serious crime if these allegations are proven to be true.
Matthew, how does this continue to haunt the administration that, after all, continues, even though the traveling White House right now is on the other side of the world?
In some ways, it's convenient that they're over there in Asia for now while this news drops, but Sarah Sanders and the rest will certainly have to confront this when they get back. And I think it would be hard to overstate just how serious this is. Obviously, the Manafort indictment was very serious for this White House, but that was someone who left the campaign in August. Mike Flynn is someone who was with the campaign through the end, was prominent on the transition, and served in this White House over the warnings of people like President Obama, who told President Trump not to hire him. And you have to remember, it was Michael Flynn who Donald Trump was defending to James Comey and said, hey, can't we find a way to let this go? He went on to later fire James Comey, which led to Bob Mueller getting here in the first place. This Flynn case is very, very serious for the White House, even more serious than the Manafort case.
And Matthew, let's go a little deeper on that, because this is more than just a news media distinction. Flynn does put it closer to the Oval Office of a sitting president than anyone else. People may have seen splashy headlines about Paul Manafort and others, but this would put it in a different category.
That's right. At the end of the day, as important as Paul Manafort was in this campaign, he was the campaign chairman. He was helping to lead a political campaign. What we're seeing with Flynn, with these allegations, is possibly using his government office, his position as the national security advisor, to be basically doing deeds on behalf of a foreign government. It's a question of who in the White House knew about this. We know that Flynn allegedly misled the vice president, but having this so close to the Oval Office, and then again, having the president himself ask the FBI director to back away from this investigation, that raises so many red flags, and obviously Bob Mueller is digging into that.
Julia, assisting the prosecution, as often is the case, there is a grand jury sitting in Washington, D.C. You've learned further about their schedule of late. What can you report about that?
Yes, that's right, Brian. So we know that the grand jury that's been impaneled by Robert Mueller will be interviewing witnesses about Flynn's lobbying activities through the end of next week. That's important because a lot of people have been waiting for a Flynn indictment for some time. Since the Manafort indictment, we've thought that Flynn would be the next shoe to drop. We know that Mueller is continuing these interviews, which shows us two things. One is that he really wants to drill deep and get as much information on Flynn as he possibly can. And it also shows that Flynn perhaps could be cooperating, and that's why this timeline has been extended.
Counselor, I want to hear you out on a piece in Time magazine written by the former assistant director of counterintelligence for Mueller while at the FBI, Robert Anderson. The headline is How Robert Mueller Works a Case, and here's a quote from it in part. When you talk about people who are used to spending nearly $1 million in 3 years on business suits out of a place in Cyprus, these guys are not going to do 25 years in jail. That's why Bob Mueller's going about this the way that he is. He knows these guys are not seasoned criminals, and he knows they're going to roll over on each other. Mark my words, it'll start becoming a race to the special counsel's office. I also heard someone today refer to Mueller as an acupuncturist for the precision with which they've gone about the case so far. Your reaction?
Well, that's the idea, clearly. I mean, that was, I think, the point behind the substance and the heft of the Manafort and Gates indictment was to get them to cooperate. And similarly here, they have charges that they could bring on Flynn already, but the registration, the Foreign Agents Registration Act offense and a false statements offense is not maybe enough to get him to flip. So you bring, potentially, if they can, these charges, which are significantly more serious. And Flynn already, unlike Manafort, has indicated an interest in getting immunity and perhaps cooperating. So I think they think if they can get a serious enough offense against Flynn, then he's definitely flipping.
Do you concur with what seems to be the present attitude that we know between 1% and 10% of what's going on? For all our fancy reporting and all the talking we devote to this, Mueller runs a very tight ship.
I think that's right. I mean, and that's the way it should be, honestly. I mean, these are confidential investigations that are going on, and until they bring actions that are meant to be public, then I agree that they should stay confidential, despite the great work of the news media. But I think we have a lot to learn still, and hopefully they will be able to do their work, and we'll find it out when it's time.
And Matt, let's just delve briefly into the Trump agenda. While all this is going on, we're hearing a lot about tax cuts and tax reform, and soon the traveling circus is going to come back to town, and we're going to be all about Capitol Hill once again.
That's right. I mean, we know this administration has a hard time driving one message. We've seen that this week when tax reform and the Asia trip were supposed to be the big thing. Obviously, Roy Moore made short work of that. Between this controversy down in Alabama and the White House having to answer for that, and Mueller's investigation expanding and these new questions about Flynn, you couple that with the fact that this tax bill looks like it actually raises taxes on a fair amount of middle-class families. That's a lot of issues for the White House to be coming back to, and this is not an environment that's friendly to something as complex and politically difficult as tax reform.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
Today, the National Republican Senatorial Committee announced it's severing its fundraising relationship with Roy Moore for the special election to an Alabama Senate seat on December 12th because of a 14-year-old girl and a 16-year-old girl and a 17-year-old girl and an 18-year-old girl with whom Roy Moore had inappropriate contact when he was a 32-year-old assistant district attorney, according to a report in the Washington Post based on interviews with over 30 sources in Alabama. Roy Moore let 24 hours pass in the face of these accusations before finally raising his voice in his defense today, but he still did not dare to show his face. And so he presented himself to the safest possible forum in America to make his case, Sean Hannity's radio show, where Sean Hannity asked Roy Moore a series of leading questions that he never would have been allowed to ask if he was Roy Moore's defense lawyer in a courtroom. Sean Hannity tried to help Roy Moore in every way he possibly could, but as lawyers who represent guilty clients can tell you, he couldn't get the sound of guilty out of Roy Moore's voice. Roy Moore denied a statutory rape allegation made by Lee Korfman about what Roy Moore did to her when she was 14 years old. In response to Roy Moore's denial, Lee Korfman gave a statement to a local news affiliate in Alabama today, stating, "I stand by my comments. The article is very detailed. Anyone with questions should please reread it. And I want to say thank you to my friends and others who have supported me and my story." And so we will reread some of those accusations. Lee Korfman's mother supported her story of meeting Roy Moore in the courthouse where Roy Moore was an assistant district attorney. The Washington Post reports he struck up a conversation with Korfman and her mother, and offered to watch the girl while her mother went inside for a child custody hearing. He said, "Oh, you don't want her to go in there and hear all that. I'll stay out here with her," says Korfman's mother, Nancy Wells, 71. "I thought, how nice for him to want to take care of my little girl." According to the Washington Post report, Roy Moore had other plans for her little girl. He called her on the phone, set up a date with a 14-year-old girl, arranged a place to pick her up where her mother wouldn't know, and drove her 30 minutes to his home in the woods. Lee Korfman told the Washington Post, quote, that before long, she was lying on a blanket on the floor. She remembers Moore disappearing into another room and coming out with nothing on but tight white underwear. She remembers that Moore kissed her, that he took off her pants and shirt, and that he touched her through her bra and underpants. She says that he guided her hand to his underwear and that she yanked her hand back. "I wasn't ready for that. I had never put my hand on a man's penis, much less an erect one," Korfman says. She remembers thinking, "I don't want to do this, and I need to get out of here." Every bit of Roy Moore's behavior that day with Lee Korfman was a felony punishable by at least 10 years in prison, and that is what Roy Moore denies. Roy Moore claimed today that the Washington Post is completely biased against him, as it is biased against President Trump, and that's why they wrote this article with that lie. But then, in the very same interview, Roy Moore used that very same article to prove that he was a good guy. He used the stories about the other little girls told in that very same article to prove that he is a good guy.
It's a direct attack on this campaign, and it involves a 14-year-old girl, which I would have never had any contact with, nothing with her mother or in a courthouse or anywhere else would I have done that. In fact, her allegations contradict the whole behavior pattern that the two of the young ladies even witnessed herself.
So there he is saying that the behavior pattern described by the other two teenage girls in the very same article was accurate. He wants you to believe that the other two teenage girls, and he doesn't want you to believe the 14-year-old girl who has accused him, in effect, of sexual assault and statutory rape. Okay. Here are the stories Roy Moore wants you to believe. Wendy Miller says she was 14 and working as a Santa's helper at the Gadsden Mall when Moore first approached her, and 16 when he asked her on dates, which her mother forbade. So he wants you to believe that he asked a 16-year-old on dates and that he's a nice guy because he gave up when her mother said no. Roy Moore thinks that's a nice story about a good guy in Alabama in 1979. Roy Moore wants you to believe Debbie Gibson. She was 17 when Roy Moore spoke to her high school civics class. He met her in her civics class in high school when he was speaking to the class, and he asked her out on dates. And he had several dates with the girl, 32-year-old prosecutor, the girl he met in her high school civics class. And he's very proud that the Washington Post reports that those dates did not go beyond kissing, that there was no sex on those dates, according to the Washington Post. Debbie Gibson said that Roy Moore took her to his house, read her poetry, and played guitar. The same house where the Washington Post says he assaulted Lee Korfman. Roy Moore wants you to believe the account of the 17-year-old girl dating the 32-year-old district attorney. Gloria Deason was an 18-year-old cheerleader when Roy Moore began taking her on dates that included wine. The legal drinking age in Alabama at the time was 19. They met at the mall, too. Gloria Deason says that they never had sex when she was 18 years old, dating the 32-year-old prosecutor. And Roy Moore believes that that story means that he was a good guy. That's the whole behavior pattern you just heard Roy Moore talk about. Now let's listen to the part one more time where Roy Moore is using the other girls in the story to prove that the 14-year-old is not telling the truth.
In fact, her allegations contradict the whole behavior pattern that the two of the young ladies even witnessed herself.
And that is Roy Moore pleading guilty to the 3 accusations of trying to date and dating teenage girls when he was 32 years old. A 16-year-old whose mother was there to protect her daughter from Roy Moore. A 17-year-old he met in her high school civics class, and an 18-year-old cheerleader. That's his defense, that those girls are telling the truth about Roy Moore, because they say he did not have sex with them. That's the truth. That's what he says is the truth. That was a very, very incriminating answer. Roy Moore said that he didn't remember speaking at Debbie's civics class, but he did say that he knew her. So naturally, Sean Hannity asked if he remembered going out on dates with her.
I don't remember specific dates. No, I do not. And I don't remember if it was that time or later. But I do not remember that, no.
But you know her, but you never dated her ever. Is that what you're saying?
Know her, but I don't remember going out on dates. I knew her as a friend. If we did go out on dates, then we did, but I do not remember that.
In a courtroom, if you said you don't remember if we did go out on dates when you're talking about the little girl you met in civics class when you were 32 years old, there is not a jury in America that's going to believe that you did not go out on dates. There is no man in the world who would not remember speaking to a high school civics class at age 32 and then going out on dates with one of the girls in that high school civics class. If we did go out on dates, then we did. That's his testimony. Then Sean Hannity turned to the general idea of a 32-year-old guy dating teenage girls.
Would it be unusual for you as a 32-year-old guy to have dated a woman as young as 17? That would be a, 15-year difference, or a girl 18. Do you remember dating girls that young at that time?
Not generally, no. If I did, I'm not going to dispute anything, but I don't remember anything like that.
But you don't specifically remember having any girlfriend that was in her late teens even at that time?
No, I don't remember that, and I don't remember ever dating any girl without the permission of her mother.
And then Sean Hannity had to go to a commercial, or in a courtroom, what they would have called a recess. And during the commercial, Sean Hannity clearly realized there was a serious problem for Roy Moore that just developed in that interview, that Roy Moore did not deny dating teenage girls when he was 32. And so after the commercial, this happened.
If you're 32 and you do date, again, there's a difference, 17 or 18-year-old, that's a pretty big gap for a pretty young girl. Is that something you did when you were dating? I'm not talking about the 14-year-old in that specific allegation. Would it be normal behavior back in those days for you to date a girl that's 17 or 18?
No, not normal.
If my daughter is 17, my daughter's 16 years old. If she's 17 or 18, I don't want her dating a 32-year-old.
I wouldn't either.
And you can say unequivocally you never dated anybody that was in their late teens like that when you were 32?
It would have been out of my customary behavior. That's right.
Out of my customary behavior. There's Sean Hannity doing everything he possibly can to guide Roy Moore to the correct answer, and he can't get him there. Can you say unequivocally that you didn't date anybody that was in their late teens like that when you were 32? And Roy Moore says, out of my customary behavior. That is a very different answer, a very different phrase from the word never. Sean Hannity knew exactly how deep a hole Roy Moore had dug for himself, and so he gave it one more try, and he tried to put the right words into Roy Moore's mouth in a way that would never be allowed in a courtroom. And those were the words that Roy Moore had not yet said.
In other words, you don't recall ever dating any girl that young when you were that old?
I've said no.
And you think that's inappropriate, too? That's what you're saying?
Inappropriate, yes.
And so the best Roy Moore's defense lawyer could get him to say today is that he does not recall dating any girl that young when he was that old. Does not recall. That is the Roy Moore defense. That was enough for Republican Senator Mike Lee, who tweeted this. Having read the detailed description of the incidents as well as the response from Judge Moore and his campaign, I can no longer endorse his candidacy for the U.S. Senate. And so Sean Hannity established today that he believes that if Roy Moore dated a 14-year-old when he was an assistant district attorney, that he is unfit to be a Senate candidate. And he got Roy Moore to agree with that principle. And the best Roy Moore could say is that I don't recall when it came to the question of dating teenage girls that Sean Hannity said would make him unfit for the United States Senate. I don't recall. The Washington Post reported a set of accusations that were very clear and very detailed, and Roy Moore has denied the most important and the most criminal of those accusations, the one with the most severe penalty. And then, in most of his interview today, he agreed to the other accusations, that he tried to date some of those teenage girls, but then finally left Sean Hannity with the contradiction of his own testimony when he said to Sean Hannity that he did not recall dating those teenage girls, after saying that he did date those teenage girls. That was good enough for Sean Hannity. It was okay. He accepted that. And that is good enough for the President of the United States, who is a self-confessed sexual assaulter. And it is so far, as of tonight, good enough for the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Mitch McConnell, who invited Roy Moore into the Senate, into a meeting with all of the Republican members of the Senate, and sat down with him and said, how can we help you? What can we do to help you get elected? And not one of those senators, and not Mitch McConnell, is dragging him back in and to say, what did you do with that 14-year-old girl? Not one of them. But with this very specific, sharply drawn set of allegations by women coming forward to tell their stories, I don't recall, is not good enough in the court of public opinion. It is not good enough in the court of basic human decency. Not good enough.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.